Okay, so let's continue. So in the last session, we have seen how to create a basic Java project in Eclipse and a Hello World program. Okay, so now let's continue ahead. In this session, I want to tell you about what is public static void main. Okay, so public static void main is the starting point of your program execution. The public static void main with the argument as string array. Okay, the argument name could be args or it could be anything, but the type should be string array. If you change the signature, for example, if I omit this and if I save and then I try to run the program, I say run as. See, I will not get the option of Java application here. Why I will not get that option of Java application here? Because when JVM, that is Java runtime, tries to run your program, it is going to start running your program from which starting point or which starting function. It is going to search for a function with a signature public static void main, which is taking string array as an argument. Now, when it will search when you ask to run this, you are right clicking on this .java file. Means you are asking JVM to run the .class file for hello world. So you are asking it to run hello world.class file. In the last session, we saw that when you compile your program, .java file, when you type it, it gets compiled and it gets converted into a .class file. Then that .java file, which has a main method with this signature, when you say right click run as Java application, it will pick up the .class file and of that particular hello world.java, which has this main method, it will pick up its .class and it will execute it. When it tries to execute the .class file, it is going to search for a signature with public static void main string array, but there is no string array over here. So it will say that because the main method starting point is not found, your editor is not showing you run as Java application option. Run as Java application option will only come when it gets the main method with that particular signature which is matching. The moment I say Control Z and I say Control Z, so square bracket is there and I say save. The moment I do that, I see run as Java application. Okay. So if you are not seeing anywhere Java application option trying to run your code, but when you say run as Java application option is not visible to you, it means either the main method is not there in that .class file with the given signature is not there. Okay, so you might be trying to run some .class file which doesn't have that main method. So it cannot be the starting point of your application. Okay, so it will search for this signature. Now let's see why this is static. Okay, now you have to understand in general that when you say something as a static, okay, what it means. So in general, if I declare any variable inside here, if I say int I equal to 5 semicolon. Okay, I am assuming little bit that you have a little bit knowledge of C programming and variable, how do you declare a variable, local variable. So this is just a local variable inside a function. I have declared a variable. We will go in detail with variables and all that. But this is a variable declaration which I have declared, which I have defined inside a function. So when you give any variable inside a function, it's a local variable. Okay. And the way to define any variable, why do you create a variable? To store some value. So when you say int I equal to 5, what happens is that behind the scene in the memory, a space is allocated for one integer variable I and a value 5 gets stored there. So there is fixed data size, like if it is int data type, then how much memory should be allocated for int data type? Say it will allocate 4 byte memory. And in that 4 byte memory, it will store this value which you have initialized to that variable. Okay. And because it's a local variable, where it will get allocated in the memory, which memory? The memory which is allocated to your Java program, Java runtime. For your Java runtime, some memory will be allocated to store all the data related to your program that is getting executed. In that area, because it's a local variable, in the memory, there will be two areas in memory internally. It is called as the stack area of memory. And the second one is called as heap area of memory. So it's just a conceptual classification. So in the stack area of memory, all local variables will get allocated. And in the heap area of memory, all objects will get allocated. Okay, that is the general classification. So when you create a local variable, it will get allocated in the stack area of memory. Okay, and because it's a local variable, what will be whenever you create any variable to store data inside it, two things will come with it. One is called as scope of a variable, that is the accessibility of that variable, okay, or visibility of that variable, what you call. That where you can access this I value. I can print I value over here. I can say I plus plus here. Okay, but can I say I plus plus here? No, I cannot say it here. I cannot access it outside the function. If I write a one more function, say I say ABC, void function ABC. Inside that function, can I say I plus plus? Is it visible there? No, what it says, I cannot be resolved to a variable. Cannot resolve it to a variable, but here it is can be resolved. Why? Because the scope of I local variable is the scope of a local variable is tied with its enclosing block, which is the block. Block is defined by opening curly brace and ending curly brace, which is the nearest block associated with this int I. This block of main function. It's not, its scope is not related to function. It is related to block. So block here is associated with main function. That's why. Suppose I create a one more block inside over here. If I say like this. Now I created a block here. So its scope int I can increment I here. Here it will not be an issue because I am still within the scope. Scope of int I is restricted to this block now. Open curly brace, closing curly. That is the enclosing scope. So here it is visible, but outside this block, when I try to access I, it will say that cannot be resolved. So scope of a local variable or visibility of a local variable is limited to its enclosing block. Okay, understood? If that block could be a block which you have given like this, or it could be for a block associated with if condition, or it could be a block associated with the function. So if I remove this, in that case now, which is the, now I is accessible and visible here. Why? Because what is the nearest enclosing block? This one of this function. This is the enclosing block. So the scope is, the visibility of I is there everywhere inside this block. So local variable scope visibility is for that function. And the next concept that comes into picture is lifetime of the variable. Lifetime means how much time the memory will remain allocated for that local variable. Okay, so for local variable, the lifetime will be tied with its scope. As long as the variable will remain in scope, the memory will remain allocated. When it goes out of scope, that memory will be freed. Okay, so for local variables, the visibility and lifetime of a local variable is tied with the enclosing block of where that variable is defined. Okay. Similarly, now we have not yet understood what is object and class and like that. But in general, let me tell you that if suppose, if you, in general, if you create any object, suppose, for example, this is EMP class, right? EMP class with, say, in EMP ID. Here inside, I have defined one property of employee entity, which is EMP ID, suppose. Okay. What is class? Class is just a representation of a particular entity. How do you describe any employee in your organization? Any employee in an organization or in your application, if you are trying to model a real life employee in your application, you will always want to store the employee ID property of that employee to uniquely identify an employee. Another property you might be interested in might be the employee name, because every employee is going to be associated with some name. The third property that you might be interested in, the salary of the employee. Okay, so a particular EMP class is just a representation of that entity. Okay, what are the properties in general, properties that particular entity would be having, and what are the functions that entity might be having, or what are the tasks that entity might be doing. For example, for any employee, suppose if it's in your application, it will depend on what use that application is, what use, why you're using that application for. So let's say if it's HR application and HR related employees there, and it could have, or it's account related employee application. Okay, if you're creating ENT class entity for account application, then there could be a functionality for that particular employee. If it's account department for whom you have created this employee, definitely one of the job of accounting application is to calculate the salary of the employee. So one of the functionality that it will might be having is double calculate annual salary. And it might, just return the annual salary as this dot salary into spread. Another function could be, let's say you just want to show the details of an employee. Return the details of an employee. You're interested in seeing what are the details of that employee. Okay, so this is, you can have some modifier, right? If you don't give modifier, even then it's okay. We will see modifier later on. But these are some of the functions which are associated. So normally when an entity is there, you will have some properties and some functionality related to that entity. So it's like you define what employee in your accounting application. When you want to model an employee, what are the basic data you want to capture for that entity, and the functions will mostly be modifying those properties in some way or computing something from those properties and then returning some value. Okay, so job of the function is to modify those properties or to compute something from those properties and then return it. Okay, like calculate annual salary, calculating the annual salary from the monthly salary. ToString, it's just returning the details of the current employee. Okay, whatever employee is. Okay, so here when I create this, okay, right now just this is just a representation of employee. I have not created any actual object of it. Okay, so this is like, you can say that you have like before creating a actual car, you just on paper you have just drawn details of that model, drawing of that car, what all things will be there and all that. But the actual entity is not created. To create the actual live entity, okay, where the memory will be allocated for that particular entity. Like right now, no memory is allocated for employee ID, employee name, salary. Okay, if it is a real employee in your organization or in your application that you want to capture, it's going to have some value for employee ID, like one employee ID will be one, employee name will be Ram, salary will be 5,000. You have to capture that live value for these properties. To do that is what you say as creating object, real world entity. To create that, let's say, suppose here there is a hello world, right? Or let's create another. In this package only, I can right click and I can say create new. So I'm trying to tell you, so we have seen what is local variable. What I'm trying to tell you right now is what is instance variable. So you might be thinking why she is explaining us class. Okay, I'm explaining you class because I want to explain you object, and when I explain object, I want to explain object means instance. when I want to explain object and instance, I also want to explain what is instance variable. So I want to explain you what is local variable, what is instance variable, and what is static variable. So three things we want to see over here. What are those three things that we want to see here? Sorry, I just updated my. Okay, let's see here. So the three kind of variables we want to see. First of all, for a variable, we saw that any variable, what it is, you allocate. There is a type of a variable. Then the name of a variable, like int I or double D, whatever, number, or double price. So it's the data type and name of the variable. So when you give the type, every type is associated with the kind of a value you want to store inside it. So if I want to store a floating point value with a decimal value inside it, say like this, then I will need a double value. But if it is a whole number or it's an integer, not necessarily whole number, negative numbers are you also can give. Okay. So, but not a fractional number or a decimal number, then you will use integer. Okay. If it is a name that you want to store, then you will use a string. So depending on different kind of data, different type of data that you want to store, you have to use a corresponding container. So if it is a floating point data, decimal point data, you will use double. There are other data types also which are similar to double. We will see that. Integer, if it is you want to store integers in general, positive, negative numbers, and zero. If you want to store double inverted values like string kind of a data, then you have to use a string data type. It's int, double are the built-in basic data type called as primitive data type. String with a capital S is an inbuilt class in Java. Okay, so int and double are primitive data type. String is not a primitive data type. It's a class in Java. Then there is one more data type called as Boolean. So you can have a Boolean when you want to store true false kind of a value. Okay, I have not given true in double inverted, it's just true. So Boolean can have only true and false, only two values are possible. So whenever you give a type of variable, type you will give, and then you will give the name of the variable. So type will define what kind of container you want. It will depend on what kind of data you want to store in that container. And when you say the type of container is double, you also in a way talk about the size of that container. So if it is a double, then it is say 8 bytes. If it is integer, then it's going to allocate a memory or a container of 4 bytes. So whatever value you can assign to it can be 4 bytes long. Whatever value you can assign to a double container can be 8 bytes long. Boolean is just 1 bit. Yes or no, na? 1 or 0. So true means 1 and false means 0 internally, but you cannot assign 1 and 0 directly. Okay. But to store it, only 1 bit is sufficient. Okay. So like that, depending on different type of container, you will have different sizes also that will be allocated in memory. And whatever value you assign will be stored in that memory location. Okay. And you can either define a variable like this, and then in the next line you can assign a value to it, or you can do it in one go, like you can define a variable and you can assign a value to it. But remember that before assigning, you have to define the variable so that You mention the type and then you assign. So without defining, you cannot assign. For example, if I comment out this line, and if I try to say number equal to 77.6, so I'm not defining it and I'm directly trying to use a variable by initializing it, it will give me error. Okay, so if like suppose here if I comment this line and I try to say I++, it will say cannot be resolved to value. So it's saying which I, though no memory is allocated, you are not mentioned container, you are not defined it anything. How can you use it? So just remember that before you use a variable, you have to define its type. Okay. In Java, it is mandatory to define a type. It's not optional. Okay. Later on, when we will learn JavaScript, you will see that in JavaScript, you need not mention the type of a variable. Okay. But in Java, you have. Okay. So whenever you define a variable, it's going to store some data inside it. You will give the type and the name of the variable. Type defines the kind of container. And when you give the kind of container, you can have the associated that type of data stored inside it. And when you give the container type, you are also saying what will be the size of memory that will be allocated for it. Then we saw what are the three kind of variables that are possible. We just saw what is local variable. Then now I am going to talk about instance variable. And the third, we then will be discussing what is static variable. Static variable and static method. Your main method is static method, right? So we started from there. Why? I explained you what is main. Then I told you that it is static. So when I told you started to explain you about static, I first told you what is local variable. What is instance variable? I will be explaining shortly. I explained you what is class and what is object. Object is called as instance. So any properties which are associated with object or instance are called as instance variable. And third is static variable. Okay. But before that, I also told you that whenever you allocate or define any variable, two concepts come along with it. That is the visibility or scope of that variable, which I have already explained. So I will not explain it again. You can go back in the video and you can check it out if you don't remember it. So visibility or the scope of that variable, and another is the lifetime of that variable. How much time the memory will remain allocated. You cannot keep the memory allocated forever, right? Once its usage is over, you have to free that memory so that it can be used to store some another value. Okay, so any variable, be it local, instance, or static, each of them is going to have some visibility and some lifetime associated with it. And it's going to be different. For local variable, the visibility scope will be different, the lifetime will be different. Instance variable, it will be different. Static variable, it will be different. Local variable, I already explained you that the visibility or the scope is related to blocks. It's a block scope. And the lifetime is also associated with its scope. As long as it will remain in a scope, the lifetime and the memory will remain allocated. Okay, when it goes out of scope, the memory can be freed. Right. Now, what is instance variable? We just now saw that when you create a class, it's just a representation of an entity which you want to model as a part of an application. Say for HR account application, you have employee. If you are creating an Amazon application, you might model entity like customer or a shopping cart. Okay. And customer will store all the attributes related to real world customer. Shopping cart will store the properties related to shopping cart. That number of items in that cart will be one of the property of a shopping cart. Item will be another entity. For every item, there will be properties like item number, item name, the quantity of that item. So all these entities you will model as for a Amazon application, which is a shopping based application. So depending on different kind of application, you will have different entities. Okay, if it's an account application inside which is going to be used in your organization by account department and they want to model a real world employee, there will be those properties and the associated functions which are relevant to accounts. Okay, calculate annual salary. If it is for HR purposes, you might not have this function, but it is going to be accounting application. So you have relevant properties and relevant functions which you model for that entity. Okay. Then when you create a class, it's just a representation. You have not created the actual live entity of it. So create that. What you will do, suppose I created in this package, I create one more class called as use one, and I add a main method to it as of now. Okay, and now I want to create the actual entity. So how I will do it? Say this. So when I say EMP I create a variable. Again, over here also same thing is there. First, you have to define a variable. Variable is E. What is the type of that variable? Now it is not primitive data type like int, double, or something like that. I want to create a user-defined type. What is a user-defined entity? Employee is my user-defined entity. And I want to create a variable of that type. So I will say what? EMP E. So E is a variable of type employee. If I ask you what is a static type, okay, of E variable, then you should say the static type is employee. Or compile time type, we also call it as a compile time type, or the static type of employee, which is of E variable is employee, called as a static type or compile time type. Then in the next line, if you create a variable of type employee, it means you can create an object of that type and assign to that particular reference. So E is variable or it is called as reference, especially when it is a user-defined type variable, you can also call that variable as a reference. प्रिमिटिव टाइप का वेरिएबल है तो उसे सिंपली वेरिएबल बोलते हैं, बट अगर क्लास का वेरिएबल है तो उसे जावा में रेफरेंस बोलते हैं. So it is commonly called as reference. So whenever you say reference, it means it is an object variable, object type. Okay. So in the next line, so here I'm just defining a type, and in the next line I'm actually creating an entity. So how do you create an actual runtime entity? By using new operator. New in Java creates the actual entity. And how then what you will say, which kind of entity you want? EMP. So you will say class name and given by round bracket. Now you will see that it's something like a function that I am calling, but it is not a function. Okay, it's called as a constructor in Java. Okay, so constructor is used to construct the object of that type. Object of which type? Of EMP type. Based from the class name, you understand that you want to create an object of employee. So it will construct the employee object. Round bracket means it is you're calling a constructor. What does a constructor do? Constructor's job is to allocate the memory for all the properties of employee. You want to create a real world entity, right? So you have to allocate memory for it. How much memory it will allocate? It will search for a combined memory of one integer, one string and one double. एक employee create कर रहे हो आप, right? तो उसके लिए एक employee के लिए उसका employee ID रहेगा, employee name रहेगा, salary रहेगा. तो total इसकी जितनी size है, int का 4 byte, string का suppose 4 byte है suppose, double का 8 bytes है, तो total जो भी है 4 plus 8 plus 8 जो भी है, that much memory will be allocated behind the scene. Okay, it will be allocated. And also it will store some default values. So if it is an integer, then the default value of 0 is stored. If it is a decimal like double, float, etc., it will store 0.0. Okay, so salary 0.0 value आ जाएगी, employee ID के लिए 0 आ जाएगा. और अगर string class type है, primitive type नहीं है, string inbuilt type है, but user defined type है, but inbuilt है. नहीं, user defined type नहीं है, sorry, inbuilt type है. इनबिल्ट क्लास टाइप है. एम्प्लॉय यूजर डिफाइंड क्लास टाइप है. यूजर डिफाइंड मतलब आपने दिया है और वो क्लास टाइप है. ये भी क्लास टाइप है बट ये इनबिल्ट है, जावा का खुद का है, राइट? सो इफ इट्स अ स्ट्रिंग एंड यू डोंट असाइन एनी, यहाँ पे मैंने कुछ दिया नहीं है ना कंस्ट्रक्टर में, मैंने एक्चुअल वैल्यूज पास किए क्या? आईडी के लिए कुछ पास किया है? नहीं. नेम के लिए कुछ पास किया, सैलरी के लिए कुछ पास किया है क्या? एक्चुअल वैल्यूज नहीं. तो व्हेन यू डोंट पास एनी वैल्यूज, इट विल कम, इट विल क्रिएट अ मेमोरी, इट विल allocate a memory and initialize it with default value. So integer will have 0, double will have 0.0, and if it is a string, it will be null. Any class type reference है, and if you're not initialized it, it will come with a value called as null. Null means it is not pointing to any object. Null means it's not pointing anywhere right now. Currently, it is not referring to any object. So when you say string, it is treated as class type ना, मतलब इसकी value object होगी. ओके अंडरस्टूड। ये तो प्रिमिटिव टाइप है। प्रिमिटिव टाइप मतलब ऑब्जेक्ट टाइप नहीं होता। प्रिमिटिव टाइप मतलब बेसिक टाइप होता है। स्ट्रिंग क्लास टाइप है मतलब ऑब्जेक्ट टाइप है। तो इसकी वैल्यू क्या होगी? ऑब्जेक्ट होगी। बट कोई अभी एम्प्लॉय नेम में कोई ऑब्जेक्ट असाइन किया है, स्ट्रिंग ऑब्जेक्ट नहीं, तो बाय डिफॉल्ट अगर आपने कोई नाम नहीं दिया है तो इट विल कम विद अ नल रेफरेंस, नल वैल्यू। मीन्स नल रेफरेंस मीन्स इट्स नॉट पॉइंटिंग टू एनी मेमोरी, एनी ऑब्जेक्ट एज सच। So it will allocate a memory and initialize it. So let's see. So I'm trying to print it now. Let's see what it is printing. I have created a value, right? I have created a variable of that type. I have made it to assign to an object. So somewhere memory will be allocated. How much memory? Say, let's say 4 bytes for this, let's say 4 byte string, and for this 8 bytes. So total, let's say 9, 10, 11, 12, and another 4 bytes, say 16 bytes, some memory is allocated. Okay, understood. And some at some memory location. Okay, and whatever the starting address of that memory location, the memory will be allocated consecutively as a block. एक साथ में allocate होगी. Okay, it's not कि एम्प्लॉय आईडी किसी एक एड्रेस पे एक लोकेशन पे है, एम्प्लॉय नेम किसी अलग लोकेशन पे. नो, it will allocate a contiguous block of total size of all properties taken together, and whatever the starting address of that particular uh, location, that will be stored in this variable reference E. Yes or no? So E is the reference where it will be stored. So when you say system.out.println E dot, when I say E dot, you will see all the properties will come. E is what? A reference pointing to an employee object which is allocated in memory. It's allocated in memory. So if I have to show you, so over here, so I have to show you a object. Okay. So I have to show you when you allocate employee, what is going to happen. So let's say employee will be allocated from memory. Okay, it will be allocated from memory. Some memory will be allocated and all the values will be stored inside it. I see go here. I just told you, wait a second. So I will be also sharing with you. So person variable equal to new person, just like employee equal to new employee. So when you do that, this is a him is a variable name. So him is a pointer, or we call it as a reference, right? So a variable will be created and it will be pointing to a person object. So this person object is like it's going to be allocated in the memory. Okay. Understood. You know that there is a RAM memory inside your computer, which is a single sequence of cells, one after another. Memory, how memory is there, you know, it's just cells with addresses, one after another, like 2000, 2001, 2002, like that, whatever. Based on whether it is a 32-bit or 64-bit operating system. If it's Windows 10 and above, it's 64-bit. So every address will be 64-bit memory cell. Okay. So person object will be, we saw that depending on what properties person has, that much memory will be allocated so that all the properties of a one person can be accommodated there. Like employee equal to new EMP बोलोगे तो इसके ID के लिए name and salary के लिए allocate हो जाएगी memory and it will come with the default value. Whatever the starting address of that employee object will be stored in the employee value. Likewise, here person object allocate होती है, उसका जो starting address है, जो भी है, we need not know that, but it is stored inside that variable. And because it is stored inside that variable, see this here. When it is not pointing to any object, your reference is null. When you say null, it means what? It is not pointing to the any object currently. Okay, it might be that you created object, but later on you made that reference null. You have to understand that. We have to understand over here. Don't go with garbage collection. I have not explained garbage collection to you yet. We will go to that thing later. But what I am trying to explain over here is the reference is different. This is a reference and this is the object, or you can call it as an instance, right? So when you say reference dot, you can see all the properties of that particular object, all the visible properties of it, employee ID, employee name, salary. So when I say e dot employee, print e dot emp ID, okay, how does when you run this program, it will retrieve the value of e dot emp ID and it will print it on console. Okay, so how does it print it on console? How does it know where to go and look into the memory? So you know the starting address of this employee object which is created is stored in the employee reference. That starting address, let's say it's the 2000 location. So what it will do, it will go to the 2000 location. And from there it will offset EMP ID, which is the first property value. So 2000 से शुरू होगा तो पहले employee ID store किया रहेगा पहले 4 bytes में. So when you say e.emp ID means you are in short asking it कि 2000 से first 4 byte memory location में जो value रखी है वो उठाओ और वो यहाँ पे display करो. So get that value and access it over here and display it over here. So that is how you access the property inside the object. These properties are called as instance properties. Employee ID is an instance property. Okay. Or when you create an employee object, these three properties, employee ID, employee name, and salary will be created for employee. If I create one more object now after this, suppose I say EMP E1 equal to new EMP. And then I say E1 dot EMP ID or E1 dot ename. It's going to create one more object in memory at some different location. Again, because I'm not providing my own values over here, it will come up with default values. Okay. But when I say E1 dot EMP ID in the next line, tell me whether the EMP ID E dot EMP ID in this line and the EMP ID in this line are memory wise, are they same? Value wise, they will be same. They will come with default values, but are memory wise they same? No. Memory wise, they are different objects. When I say E equal to new EMP, say 16 bytes total memory is allocated for employee E at address 2000. When I create another object E1, same total memory of its total size of its properties is allocated as a chunk at some different location, say 3000 location. So when I say E1 dot EMP ID, it will go to 3000 location and pick up the employee ID, first 4 bytes का value, and it will show it here. When I say E dot EMP ID, starting address E में है, EMP उस object का, तो E से starting address उठाएगा, it will pick up the starting address from the reference, go to that location, and then whatever offset you have asked it, the employee ID, so it will look for that property and access its value and display. Okay, so when you create an instance properties or instance variables will be allocated with it. For as the every instance reference is different, instance object is different, this object and this object is different. Different means memory wise different. Their properties inside it are also different. When I say different, it means memory wise they are different. Okay, understood? Now I cannot prove it because there is no way in Java that you can print the addresses which are stored in the reference. So it's not like pointers in C language. C में कैसे pointer use करते हो? You can, if you print pointer, you can print the actual address of that variable. But in Java, they are very smart. They said, why do you need address? There is no need to see address. Okay. The main thing is reference, via reference, you should be able to reach that object in memory. So that will be done. So reference is something, it has some address by which it is able to reach the object and access value from that object. It is able to reach the instance and access the instance variables from there. Okay. So that is what is instance variable. So now you know that when I explain you over here what is instance variable, what does that mean? Now let's see what is the scope of the instance variable. Okay, the scope of the instance variable is what? As long scope is restricted to its reference. So when I say EMP ID, I will have to say E1 dot EMP ID. So its scope is restricted to its instance. Okay, you have to say instance variable dot whatever the property. Understood? And its visibility, what its visibility will be there, we will see about the one more thing scope is related to it, like what will be the visibility of the instance variable. Apart from that, it is tied to its instance, and you have to always say instance dot property name. Okay. Outside, when you access it, you have to say instance dot property name. And within that class, when you want to access it, you will say this dot salary. When you are inside class, you have to say this dot salary. So here suppose in the next line, suppose I say system dot out dot print line. When I say E1 dot compute annual salary over here, I call this function over here. Okay. So when you call this E1 dot calculate annual salary function, it's a function. It will go and call it there. So it will go inside. So control click अगर मैं करती हूँ, control open implementation. Control key press की मैंने, and when I take, see the mouse pointer will change. When I press control key and I take mouse here, it's saying open implementation. I click on this. Control click open implementation. Where is it taking me? It is taking me to the actual location where that function is defined. So it's going to execute. Execution is going to start from main, and then it will come on line number 13, line number 14, line number 15, where from line number 15 where it will jump? It will jump to the actual location or implementation of a function. It will jump here. And it will start executing line number 14. Line number 14 में जब आप this dot salary बोलोगे तो ये this reference किसको point कर रहा है? To whom this reference will refer to? It will refer to the current instance. So how do you know the current instance? E1 is the current instance because you have called a function on E1. So when you say E1 dot calculate annual salary, inside calculate annual salary, when you use reference this reference is referring to E1. When you say E1 dot EMP ID, okay, EMP ID belongs to what? This. Inside class, it is this dot EMP ID. वो this को refer कर रहा है E1 को. हाँ, it's the same thing if I say over here, if I copy this and I say here, E dot calculate annual. Now line number 11 execute हो गया. Line number 12 पे जब main method, it will start from main, it will go from line number 5, line number 6, like that. It will come to line number 12. Line number 12 here where it will take a jump. Again it will take jump here in the same function. But now when I say return this dot salary किसको point करेगा? This dot salary किसकी memory allocation को point करेगा? This reference to whom it will point? Will it point to E1 or will it point to E object? It will point to E object. So this will refer to the current object or current reference on whom you have called the function. Calculate annual salary आपने E पे call किया है, तो calculate annual salary function के अंदर when you say this dot salary, this dot whatever instance property, it is going to belong to that particular object on whom you are invoking the function. अगर E1 पे कॉल किया है तो अंदर फंक्शन के अंदर जब आप सैलरी या EMP ID बोलोगे, it will go to that E1 object and pick up the value from, read the value from there. Okay, so always remember that although the function definition is same, that this reference will always refer to the currently executing object, current object on whom you have called this function. So that is the difference. In normal C programming, when you invoke a function in normal C programming, you just call a function name and you invoke it. But in Java, it's not like that. Whenever you call a function, it belongs to some class. So first of all, to call a function, you have to create an object first. Without creating an object, you cannot call a function. So when you create an object or you create an instance, the memory will be allocated for that instance or object. And then you can call the functions on that particular instance reference. So when you call a function, it will go inside that function, and inside that function, it will try to access the properties of that particular instance. So when you say this dot salary, if you are invoke this function on E1, this will refer to the E1 salary. If you are calling calculate annual salary on employee reference E, then this dot salary will refer to E. Okay. So the current instance on whom you are calling the object. Okay. And it will try to access that value, calculate, get the salary multiplied by 12 and return. Right now, the salary value is 0.0. So दोनों के लिए it will be 0.0 into 12. It's going to be 0.0. So when you run it, you are going to get the same result, but their memory locations are different. Okay, तो आपको value same मिलेगी. 0.0 ही मिला आपको, बट दोनों के अंदर की वैल्यू जो सैलरी की वैल्यू रीड हुई है वो अलग अलग लोकेशन से रीड हुई. ओके, नाउ यू डोंट अंडरस्टैंड हियर दैट दे आर इंडीड डिफरेंट लोकेशंस, बट आई कैन मेक यू अंडरस्टैंड इट. कैसे? अभी तो आपने जब एम्प्लॉय क्रिएट किया, आपने कोई वैल्यूज नहीं दी एम्प्लॉय को. अगर मुझे कुछ इनिशियलाइज करना है, रियल वर्ल्ड एम्प्लॉय थोड़ी ना ऐसा होगा. ओके, इस एम्प्लॉय का क्या मतलब है? सब कुछ 0 0 आ रहा है, आईडी 0, नेम इज 0, सैलरी 0, ऐसा थोड़ी ना होता है. रियल एम्प्लॉय विल हैव सम आईडी, नेम, सैलरी. So when you want, after the memory is allocated, when you call a constructor and the memory is allocated, you don't want it to come with a default value. You want it to come with some user defined values, right? Okay, so for that you will have to then give that constructor yourself. For this default values, this constructor, even if you don't code that constructor here, have I coded that employee constructor? Ideally, I should have written this, right? I should have written this constructor with the same modifier as your class name. I should have written this constructor, and even if you don't initialize with default values, when this constructor gets called, as soon as gets called, memory will be allocated, and then automatically the memory will be allocated. For allocating memory, you don't have to write any code here. Okay, understood? Memory will be allocated and it will be initialized with default value. So if you want to see whether this is getting called, I will write statement over here. Now I have defined it. Now you will say earlier why it was working when I had not provided this constructor. Because you see, apart from this constructor, there is no another constructor defined in my class. when there is no constructor defined in your class, okay, compiler, Java compiler will insert this empty constructor for you. It will not write SOP inside it, but it will insert an empty constructor for you. Okay. So in the compile code, that empty constructor will be present, although you yourself have not defined it. But that default constructor facility compiler will only insert if you don't have any another constructor in your class. Okay, understood? So let's see, suppose, first of all, let's see ki you can take a facility of default constructor, but फिर उसमें SOP नहीं आएगा, तो आपको समझ में नहीं आ रहा है कि employee constructor call हो रहा है. I want to show you guys कि employee constructor is being called. So I am coding employee default employee का zero argument constructor myself now, क्योंकि उसमें अगर कोई SOP डालना है, SOP मतलब system.out.println statements डालने या कुछ कोड डालना है, तो आपको खुद को कोड करना पड़ेगा. कंपाइलर का डिफॉल्ट कंस्ट्रक्टर लेकर नहीं चलेगा, बिकॉज कंपाइलर का डिफॉल्ट कंस्ट्रक्टर एम्प्टी रहता है. So now I am writing my own zero argument constructor. And once you give your own zero argument constructor, obviously when you run your program, it will invoke your zero argument constructor. Zero argument because there are no arguments here. So आप compiler का default constructor facility, instead of that, you yourself have provided zero argument constructor. You are telling compiler आपका रहने दो, मैं खुद code कर देता हूँ. Okay. Now when you run it, you will see that message over here. The constructor is getting called. Can you see EMP default zero argument? दो बार क्यों दिख रहा है? Because आपने दो objects बनाए हैं ना, right? और ये पहला वाला एम्प्लॉय ऑब्जेक्ट का देखो, एम्प्लॉय आईडी प्रिंट किया आपने, जो 0 आया. फिर आपने ई जब प्रिंट किया तो ई में क्या हो रहा है? ई में क्या प्रिंट होगा? पूरा का पूरा ऑब्जेक्ट प्रिंट होगा. ऑब्जेक्ट प्रिंट होगा, कैसे प्रिंट होगा? बिकॉज व्हेन यू पास अ रेफरेंस लाइक दिस टू एसओपी, it internally converts this into, this line will be converted by compiler into so it will be converted into e.toString. Why? Because when you pass a reference to a SOP, you are asking it to show the string representation of that particular object. Employee e object का string representation, मतलब उसके values बताओ. String, as a string, you show its value. So you want that object to get converted to a string and to display those values. So your JVM understands it, your compiler understands it. So when you say E, it internally in your code, it will get converted to e.toString, and you will see that the toString method gets in. toString में आपने क्या किया है? ये रिटर्न किया है वैल्यू. आपको देखनी है कि ये इन्वोक हो रही है, तो आप इसमें भी SOP डाल दो. Right? I am not directly calling it. I am just passing E to the SOP, but you, as I said, that it will be converted into e.toString. Understood? And how will you know that really it is being done? Because toString के अंदर का जो SOP डाला है वो कंसोल पे प्रिंट हो जाएगा. ये देखो, I am toString method called. मतलब कॉल हो रहा है toString method. Okay? And it will not only call it, it will also, whatever value you are returning in that toString method, it is showing that in the SOP. प्रिंट कर रहे हो आप system.out.println में जो भी रिटर्न वैल्यू है वो प्रिंट कर रहे हो. ई डॉट toString में कन्वर्ट हो जाएगा. toString मेथड में क्या रिटर्न कर रहे हो आप? उस पर्टिकुलर एम्प्लॉय की आईडी, नेम और सैलरी रिटर्न कर रहे हो, तो वो रिटर्न हो जाएगी. और वो SOP में आपने पास किया है तो वो प्रिंट भी हो जाएगा. तो सबकी डिफॉल्ट वैल्यूज आ गए. आईडी का 0 आया, नेम का स्ट्रिंग है, ऑब्जेक्ट टाइप है तो नल आया, क्योंकि अभी किसी को पॉइंट नहीं कर रहा है, किसी स्ट्रिंग को पॉइंट नहीं कर रहा है, और सैलरी 0.0 आया. राइट? इवन का भी वैसे ही आ जाएगा, पर इवन का मैंने सिर्फ एसओपी में इवन पास नहीं किया, मैं एम्प्लॉय आईडी बता रही हूँ और कैलकुलेट एनुअल सैलरी बता रही हूँ. इसलिए देखो, व्हेन आई क्रिएट ए एम्प्लॉय इवन ऑब्जेक्ट, वो भी ऑब्जेक्ट एलोकेट हुआ विद द डिफॉल्ट कंस्ट्रक्टर, जीरो आर्ग्यूमेंट कंस्ट्रक्टर. And compiler is not providing it. I am providing that zero argument constructor. So see, if I click over here, open implementation, where it will go? It will go here. And it will execute this. That's why you see EMP default zero argument constructor called here. Right? And the moment it invokes a constructor, okay, what it will do, I will tell you, and it is going to allocate memory for the properties or instance variables and assign default values to them. Okay, and that's why when you print it later on e1.empid, उसमें value कैसे आई? Because object is already allocated, so properties are memory for properties allocated and they are initialized with default value. What is the default value? empid integer is 0. Calculate annual salary में क्या आएगा? The salary 0.0 आएगा into 12, so 0.0 ही result आएगा, right? So that's why, so this is what result you are getting it. But आपने अभी देखा कि जीरो आर्ग्यूमेंट कंस्ट्रक्टर भी कॉल हो रहा है और टू स्ट्रिंग मेथड भी कॉल हो रही है अगर आप रेफरेंस को डायरेक्टली एसओपी में पास करो। अगर आप चाहते हो इवन के भी वैल्यूज दिखाई दे तो इसको भी आप एसओपी में पास कर दो। उसके भी वैल्यूज तो 0 0 ऐसे ही आएंगे बिकॉज डिफॉल्ट वैल्यूज ही है, आपने कुछ प्रोवाइड नहीं किया है। बट हाँ, ई टू स्ट्रिंग मेथड 2 बार कॉल हो रहा है। देखो यहाँ पे ई के लिए 1 बार कॉल हुआ है e.toString और यहाँ पे e1.toString, तो टू स्ट्रिंग मेथड कॉल्ड अगेन बट दिस टाइम फॉर e1। ये जो वैल्यूज आपको दिख रहे हैं empid 0, emp नल सैलरी, वैल्यू सेम है बट ये लोकेशन अलग लोकेशन से पढ़ के आए। इट इज एक्सेसिंग इट फ्रॉम डिफरेंट लोकेशन बिकॉज इट बिलोंग्स टू e1। ओके, so this is zero argument employee constructor. Okay, and let's now, as I said, I am not interested in giving the default values. I want to provide some proper values. So I write a and then I say this dot empid equal to id, this dot name equal to name, and this dot equal to salary. So, and I will write यहाँ पे inside this emp argument wala constructor is called because arguments are there here, right? And I want to construct employee object, allocate memory for that employee object and initialize it with these values which I am passing in the constructor. I want to initialize with my own values. So let's do that. Let's here now, this employee object 0 argument wala hai, इसमें हम values pass करते 1, then Ram, and then there is a salary, so 20,000. Okay, in same ना integer है, फिर है string और फिर double. Now let's see. Can you see empid 1, employee name Ram, salary 20,000. e1.empid की वैल्यू 1 आ गई, कैलकुलेट एनुअल सैलरी में भी 20,000 into 12 किया तो 2,40,000 आ गया। So even because even is allocated in memory at different location and its properties are initialized with the empid as 1, e name as Ram and this as 20,000। एम्प्लॉय ई की वैल्यूज भी अलग लोकेशन पे लेकिन उसके डिफॉल्ट वैल्यूज आ जाएंगे तो क्या है 0 आएगा 0.0 और नेम नल आएगा, राइट? और एक बना लो चाहिए तो, और एक एम्प्लॉय E2 सपोज, तो रन करो। देखो अगेन अ कंस्ट्रक्टर आर्ग्यूमेंट वाला कंस्ट्रक्टर कॉल्ड दिस टाइम, नॉट अ 0 आर्ग्यूमेंट कंस्ट्रक्टर, है ना? आर्ग्यूमेंट वाला कंस्ट्रक्टर कॉल्ड, देन एम्प्लॉय आईडी की वैल्यू प्रिंट हो गई, है ना? 2 वैल्यू प्रिंट हो गई 2 और फिर क्या प्रिंट हो रहा है? एनुअल सैलरी प्रिंट हो गई। So now you understand that these are different objects and they are allocated differently in memory and so their instance properties will have different memory allocation and different values. So now you understand what is a instance variable. Their scope is, when you say reference name, their scope is attached to that reference. Okay, apart from that, there will be certain modifiers like public, private, default that we will see later. Okay, and memory, what is related to memory of the instance variable? How long the instance variable's memory will remain allocated, that is the lifetime of the instance variable. As long as instance is accessible. How much instance is accessible? As long as there is some reference referring to that instance, okay, it is accessible. So its memory will remain allocated. Okay, if there is no reference pointing to it, then that memory could be free. So that we will see what it means. So we will see in the next session what is the lifetime of an instance variable. Okay, it's how it is tied to garbage collection concept in Java, memory allocation and deallocation of an instance or object, how it is tied with garbage collection. Okay, and then we will also see what you mean by static variables. Static variables are not local variables, they are not instance variables, they are class level variables. So static variable memory is allocated for the entire class. Its memory is shared by all objects of that class. So if I create a static variable, okay, what will happen is all objects E1, E2, E, all of them will share the same static variable. Instance variables is not like that. No, they are allocated separately for E1, for E2. E2's EMP ID and E1's EMP ID is different location, right? But if it is a static variable, that memory will be shared by all instances of employee. So what is static variable? That also we will see in the next session. So in this session, we just saw what is variable, how do you define a variable, how do you initialize it, then the concept of lifetime and the scope associated with the variable. Concept of lifetime and scope associated with a variable. Then we saw what is local variable, what is the scope of local variable, and how the memory access or lifetime of local variable is. Then we saw what is class. Then we created an instance of class, and we saw what is instance variable. Then we saw what is the scope of an instance variable. How do you access it? By creating a reference first, object reference, and saying reference dot property. And now next we will be discussing the lifetime of an instance. When it gets allocated, that we have already seen. When you create an object by calling its constructor, it gets allocated. Well, we have to see when it gets deallocated, when its memory gets freed. That we will see in the next session. And we will also see what do you mean by static variable in the next session. Okay. So that's it. Let's meet in the next session. Thank you, everyone.